So we're going to move on to the leadership panel. Just to raise a few questions that are hot topics at the moment. And if I could ask the following to take their seats. We have John Weston, Managing Director, Digiplex. We have Sami Holopainen, who's joining us from Telecity. Seppo Ihalainen, somebody tell me if I say somebody pronounced it wrongly. Managing Director Piccolo. Peter, I'm going to struggle with this one. I'm going to try. Pierre, Direct. Thank you. My apologies. Director EMEA, Hewlett Packard. And Johan Ekes-Jör.
Vice
President of Cloud Computing Nordics IBM.
Great stuff. I think you've probably all heard enough from me about our moderator panel, and I think what's really good about this panel is it's an absolute mix from the data center providers we're seeing where the demand is coming from, and the technology side. And so we can just mix the two, just understand how technology is changing, how we're seeing that change the demand, and also how that's filtering through to some of the existing co-location facilities and driving the demand. So I think we'll kick off and say, I've gone through where I think some of the key demand drivers are and how we're seeing a split now between traditional latency-dependent demand and then more cloud-driven demand being more flexible and that entire split. But I'm interested to ask the panel and go through and just get views in terms of how they're seeing demand being driven at the moment, what are the core drivers that they're seeing. So perhaps, Sami, do you want to kick off and talk about what you're seeing?
Yeah, good morning everyone. I'm looking here from the perspective of Telestic Helsinki mainly, not in the whole Telestic group perspective. So the local demand here is mostly driven by old in-house data centers moving toward centralized co-location facilities. The trend which has happened in Europe and US several years ago is now happening here. So we are still seeing a lot of big enterprises, small companies who are running their own data centers in their own facilities. And they are slightly moving more and more to professional facilities where they have connectivity, they have 24/7 visibility, they have some managed services and stuff like that. That's the basic driven, which is happening locally here. Then there is this Gabriel said it all. There's a lot of interest in Finland today. There's a lot of international companies asking to place, either they want to have green power, they want to have cheap power, they want to have a skilled workforce, or one big driver is the proximity to Russia. There's a lot of companies in Europe and US who want to serve content or serve their services into Russian or Baltic countries. And Finland is a good location for that. We have good connectivity, skilled workforce and everything here. But also we see where it's coming from Russian companies who are expanding outside of Russia. The Finland is a good position. They're asked to co-location here because I believe there's a lot of Russian companies in the audience here. But what we see here is that Russians look at Europe as one country. Finland is a good place to have servers and content, whatever they serve. And I think I'll have something else for others to do.
Great. Okay, so perhaps if we move to Seppo then, just get your view from Vico.
Okay. Good morning everyone. Generally, I really agree with Sami and Gabriel earlier. One thing which is also we have seen changing and also seeing some analysis changing that outsourcing of the data center industry is also changing from traditional data center market to outsourcing to the cloud and infrastructure as a service. What it means for us is that our customer is different. It's not anymore CIO. It's a service provider or the software company who is transforming the business to cloud. So I'm also
significance of the price of power, which you gave quite a low significance rating to. I think the price, and I think you were referring in euros of 0.0678 for Finland. That's about right. So if you're going to take for a wholesale flexible data center operator at say 1,000 meters or just low power, about a megawatt, that means you've got a power bill of about 0.9 million euros. So anybody can come in with a 10% reduction on that, be it Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, is going to attract interest because the big flexible users that you're trying to attract here are going to be 20,000 meters, 20 megawatts. So we're talking of 15 million per annum euros on power. So your power pricing is really important because there's a lot of competition and the margins between the other Nordics at the moment is quite tight. So I would strongly recommend you keep your eye on power because the customers that are coming to us, power price, green supply is VIP. The other thing that I'd also flag up is we've heard today of the competencies, which strikes me as a really strong asset because yesterday during the Green Grid discussions there were lots of metrics tabled, but one metric that wasn't tabled was uptime, because if you're not a data center, unless it's up 100%, and you'll have all seen the announcements and embarrassments from people like Amazon and Twitter when their data centers have gone down. Now, if you're coming here, any of these operators, they're going to expect 100% uptime. And therefore the challenge is how you're going to achieve that. If you drive around the back of any local hospital, you'll see a container with a generator in it. And that's just in case you're on the operating table or your wife or your mother and the power goes off, that they carry on operating. Well, the big international flexible buyers have a similar attitude. Now, yesterday I heard that one local data center here is reliant on the local power infrastructure, 2 or 3 different hydro stations, and that's considered sufficient resilience that there aren't on-site generators. Well, that might be okay for academia, but I'm really concerned, is it okay for the big flexible users? Are Google willing to operate a data center without generators? So that's one challenge. Are they able to operate without UPS? It's another challenge. But the really interesting one is, have you got the labour force and the technical staff that will operate the plant at 100% uptime? And that's a cultural attitude. And we've been operating in the Nordic region for just over 10 years. And we found that when we first came, it wasn't an implicit capability. We had to train people. You know, you sort of kick the Anglo-Americans for their workaholic attitude. But basically, the technicians that we brought are accustomed to working whatever hours it is necessary to keep the data center up. Other countries we go to, we find everybody clocks off at 1600 hours. You can't operate a data center with a mentality that says, I go home at 1600 hours. And you can't import an uptime culture just as quickly as you can import a generator. You have to inculcate it and train people. And as we've heard, you've got a good residue of staff here that potentially do it. But don't take that attitude and that cultural approach for granted, because it's taken us a very long time to get into place.
Great, okay. So let's just move on to the sort of technology side and speak from the HP side. Are you seeing cloud technology actually driving demand at the moment, or what trends are you seeing from the HP side?
Well, let me look at things first from an overall perspective. I think as a rule of thumb, we've been looking at the increase of power in the overall data center market doubling every 6 years, roughly right. And I saw statistics recently that are still supporting that growth of the overall power being used in the data center market, so supporting that growth actually. And of course drivers like video and mobile are drivers that we expect us to continue that growth overall. But let's look at changes in the kind of demand that is currently happening. A data center is a very large capital investment, and investors are keen to protect their investment and to make sure that they do the right things. The economical lifetime of a data center is meant to be 15 years roughly on it. That's a long time. If I go back 15 years, I was working for Global Crossing and I was actually building 43 data centers across Europe. And the way we build those data centers is really quite different than we build them today. I mean, we didn't worry about power, we didn't talk about PUEs. It was just a big hall with a lot of air conditioning, and we didn't worry about the power at all. Actually, we didn't even build the power to customers. So a lot has changed in those 15 years. And so again, investors want to protect their investment, and looking 15 years ahead is a long time. Now, cloud and virtualization do bring a lot of change. They decouple the applications from the hardware much more than it did in the past. And actually, virtualization is stacking applications onto one server. So one would expect that the power density, it has been stable for quite a while, 1.5 to 2 kilowatts per meter, might actually go up. That wouldn't be a very surprising fact. Space is a question mark. Some people talk about shrinking data centers. So will space go up? I mean, remains to be seen. But so the overall tendency there is with a lot of customers uncertainty. How will data centers grow? How do I make sure that I protect my investment over 15 years? And I'm flexible enough to deal with any changes that come up as a result of clouds, virtualization, and anything else that may still come up and we don't know about. So what you should really see coming up is modular, scalable data centers. It's often used. It's not to be confused with containers. That's something completely different. But modular and scalable, meaning that you can extend the surface by adding modules, but you can also extend the power within one module by adding power and cooling for that specific model. And that's important. What else is important is that the horizon of an investor has become shorter. So they only want to invest at the moment that they see the investment is really bringing value. So they don't want to build something that's ready in 2 years' time. And it's more like 6 months. So we are moving towards more industrialized data centers with pre-manufactured components that can be brought into servers and into operation in a relatively short time. So pre-manufactured, industrialized components, industrialized data centers, I have to say. That's a trend that I see happening in the market right now. And again, that's not to be confused with containers. Containers is a very specific market segment, and it's quite distinct from scalable modular data centers, industrialized data centers.
And then you focus on cloud computing. So is that really driving demand, do you think, at the moment?
I think you have to look at, really from the business side, what the driving forces are going forward, and that will then, at the final end, come to that you need a very efficient data center. And I think John mentioned a crucial part, that it has to be 365, 24/7. Just think of yourself when you're using whatever, Google, your internet banks, you swear when it's down for 15 minutes. And everything goes, it has to be up all the time, that's going to be crucial. Then from a cloud perspective, I mean, cloud is nothing revolutionary, it's an evolution of really how you consume IT. And of course, cloud drives a new demand of data centers and how you then really could leverage the actual hardware in a much, much more efficient way. That's the main drivers of the cloud. Instead of having a 15% utilization of the server used through virtualization, but specifically through automation, can have an 85% usage of that capex, which is a very, very strong driver towards consolidation. And the other aspect as well in this market is that the sourcing is going on, and you heard that from our Finnish colleagues, Seppo, and that many companies, the larger ones, have many outsourced already. So you see a concentration in large scales of centers, and that's going to continue. Now we see lots of the mid-sized companies going the right way, The question is, do they want to have co-location, or do they want to have someone that's running the service for them? And we're going to see more and more they want to have someone running the full service. And then another aspect of cloud is also important to focus on, that from the business side in the corporations, they're really going to look at which applications can support their business processes, and we're going to see much more of the so-called software as a service. You probably heard about Salesforce.com, that is providing a CRM system through some data centers they have around the globe. And that market is going to grow a lot of all the software houses, the ISVs, where they're going to look for possibilities to deliver their software as a service. Then when it comes to the relocation of those centers, which is for providers like an IBM, like an HP, or like many of the co-location, then it's going to be very dependent on the network. As said, the power prices, I fully agree on that. We see more and more of that, and that's why Google went to Finland, Facebook went to Luleå in Sweden. And the possibility of really having 365 24/7 is going to be crucial for many companies. Not all, and not all application, and that's the other aspect. That's going to be a division of different kinds of application, what they're going to require, and where you might locate different applications. Even though I don't think you're going to spread them wide, because then you need a governance structure between those different locations as well, between the applications. So there are lots of factors impacting of actually where the decision is taken from a corporation, which at the end comes down to where the data center spaces.
Okay, but just building on that thing, I won't concentrate solely on cloud. This isn't just a cloud discussion, but two common points raised to me by particularly corporate occupiers when we talk about cloud computing, cloud technology. Number one, a concern over security of data, and the other one about the regulatory issues concerning criminal data into other countries. Are those real issues, or are things being done, particularly on the security side, to allay those concerns? Maybe we'll just start with Peter again from the HP side, and we can go through to the Colo guys.
Are there real issues? Are there not? I think that's a big question mark in the market. I do know, if I look at, for instance, financial institutes, they want to, they're looking at cloud applications, and they're looking at building cloud facilities. But public cloud, of course, is an area that contains a lot of unknowns. So generally, I think they're moving more towards a flexible structure in which they have both private clouds and let's say the old-fashioned server farms supporting their services, and they're not banking on one or the other. So I see, let's say, a lot of different directions for different verticals in the market, if you will.
I agree on that, and it's also so that there's another aspect when you talk about the cloud. Depending on where you put different kinds of applications, it's also, which you brought up a bit earlier on, is the latency. Because when you look into many, not all, but many of the corporate applications, they can't live with the latency. I mean, having it here in Finland and providing it out of Germany and having a corporation in Germany, then it probably works. But there are latency aspects that you really have to think of in that aspect. On the security side, I think that for many corporations, and specifically when you go into the mid-sized companies, I'm 100% sure of that any provider, whether it's a cloud services or a sourcing service, is having a better security level than that little mid-sized company, because they don't have the skills, they don't have the knowledge about it. When you go into large corporates, perhaps, but in that sense, security shouldn't be an issue. It might be a perception, but it isn't. And then lastly, one has to look at all the public sector, and there are some legacy issues or legislation in where privacy of data, where data resides, that's probably not too many of the public governmental organization can locate. They will go to shared services for sure, but will probably mainly still be within the country and not go out in the country. There are discussions within EU how you can place it in the EU, but that's an issue that has to be worked together with them.
Okay, great. John, anything that you're seeing on that side?
Yeah, I think first, anytime anyone comes up to you and expresses a concern for security, first question you ask them is, please define exactly what you mean by security. Because I find there's a whole spectrum of different definitions of security. And I think what you're saying, Gabriel, you're referring, I believe, automatically to the security of data. But an awful lot of the operators and the customers I've been, they use the term security for uptime. Then they mean security of the facility. Then they mean that data. And if we're talking about security of data, we're in a whole chain of partnerships as to who's responsible for which bit. So I, as a colo operator, can secure a facility. I can encourage the most secure carriers, and I can do a certain amount of security on the customer's own operators. And frequently, customers come to us, and we did a survey 5 years ago, and went to various customers and said, why have you come to us, or why have you put the data with us? And they basically said, for security from our own employees. So do check out what is the security issue that that customer or that person is really concerned about, and then you can look at the specific issues. There are technologies developing so fast. If you went into a data center 5 years ago, you'd have a keypad, possibly you'd have a thumbprint, possibly you'd have an iris, and everybody says they love security, and when they come to us when we bid, they really put us through the mill on what's your security. When they actually come into our data center as a customer and have to go through our security processes, they hate it because it's so limited. So, but technology is going on that all the time we can improve security. So now we use facial recognition software. So you won't get in the building as you come up the street path unless we already logged you. So there are tricks all the way down the chain. But the first thing is define what you mean by security. Because you may be asked to address a security issue that is not actually your responsibility or capability.
Okay, thank you, John.
Yes. We have seen a couple of times this security is raised by customers, but most of them have been the governmental customers from Asia and other countries. In the private sector, we haven't really seen this is an issue.
It's basically a matter of trust. I mean, do you really trust that company you are giving all your data off? That doesn't matter. Do they have a face recognition? Do they have biometric authentication? What they have? Do you trust the company? It can deliver what you want? Can they manage the problems? And do they have a reliable track record that they actually can do things they promised to do? So simple.
Okay, so changing tack slightly, I think I wanted to cover off something I read recently, which was that one of the biggest drivers to growth within the particular colocation markets in the Nordic region is now increased willingness to consider outsourcing and not letting your data center in-house. I wanted to see whether or not that's something that we think there is a lot of latent demand being built up from organisations and the public sector that traditionally get their data in-house in the region, or is a lot of that already been done and pushed into an outsourced data centre? So, John, what are you seeing in Oslo?
Oslo was definitely behind the curve of outsourcing in Western Europe. So we opened our first data centre in Oslo in 2001, and outsourcing was quite a rare phenomenon at that time. And the business really only picked up about in 2006, and by 2006 outsourcing in your tier 1 cities was on hat. What I think is very interesting about the Nordic region is that something like 45% of our customers are governmental affiliations. You certainly do not get that scale of outsourcing in UK and other Western European countries from government sources. So there is a greater openness and willingness in governmental there's not the resistance that I encounter in the UK.
Okay, Johan?
Yeah, regarding the public sector, as I mentioned before, that they will move, and they are in relative terms after some other countries around Europe, and if you look into the US as well, here in the Nordics. The question then is it co-location? Is it with some of the already present service providers? And that's going to be a mix of them. But I really see that they are having a strong drive now, because they also need to cut costs. And currently their infrastructure, the data center being part of it, but it's really the whole management of the whole infrastructure is in relative terms relatively costly. And they're driving towards those shared service centers. And as I said before, they most likely are going to keep all that within the country. So I think that's going to be a large part going forward over the next couple of years. And but legacy issues, privacy issues, is going to be within the countries.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I see consolidation as a topic on the agenda of the public sector in general. It's not restricted to the Nordics, but I definitely see it in the Nordics. But in many other countries, I think, yeah, as Jan already said, it's very focused on consolidating cost. But it's also within a political environment, so it's a very slow process. But you see that a lot of governments have sprawling data centers all over their country, and from small closets to large outdated data centers, and maybe some more sophisticated ones in certain countries. And that's a big challenge to have that consolidated in only a couple which are required for the public sector in that country. And I see that, well, for the next 5, 6, maybe even longer period of time, being a process that will continue to evolve and represent a lot of investment of those public sectors into those few data centers that they actually need.
Right, and if we look at Helsinki specifically, do we think there's a lot of inherent demand there coming out now of the traditional occupiers who have in-house data centers?
Yeah, that's the main point here. There's a lot of in-house data centers currently, which are moving to professional facilities. That's the main driver even locally, I think. And we've seen that this happening in the US and Europe several years ago, and I believe that trend will be on Finland also. And also I see that the government is making some also outsourcing companies, and I think that will help also in coal market.
Yes, that's which is happening in Finland, especially in the public sector. I think they have calculated that in the city sector they have somewhere between 850 and 1,000 data rooms around Finland. They do the consolidation, but they do not only focus for co-location, they are building the kind of cloud platforms for kind of community platforms for kind of common use. What we have seen also that, okay, let's put it another way, Yahoo was presenting 2 weeks ago in data center Dynamics Sweden that they moved out from New York because it was too expensive. And if we look at in Europe, that could be our New York here. So why we would move to the Helsinki or Oslo? Oslo is the second, the most expensive city in the world, and the Helsinki is number 13. There are lots of options behind of these cities to do the same what Yahoo did in US.
Okay, so
Can I just add one more thing?
yeah,
Because I think another aspect that's going to be important being within the data center side of it, that we hear about government, they have lots of smaller, but there are some large centers as well. And with the consolidation, that's going to be needed less square meters to actually do the operations they have today with new technologies, etc. But there's going to be a large financial calculation. I don't know whether it's large enough because I'm not into the real data center economics, whether you refurbish because there's going to be lots of space given up, or whether is it more efficient to build a new one and just close down the old ones. I think that's important for the ones that are in this data center business, think which way is the time going, and you know, those guys know that better than I do.
We do it in IBM, but I don't know personally.
Yeah, I think that's a big item for many companies who have existing data centers, and they need to decide whether to retrofit or to build a new data center. And the first question they need to raise is, why do I need to retrofit in the first place? Do I need more power? Do I need, for instance, higher efficiency? What's the reason for actually wanting the retrofit or maybe even a new building? And then it's really a complete risk assessment and a business analysis that you need to follow in order to make a proper decision there. Because there's a lot of risk involved in doing a retrofit, especially if you want to keep the data center operational during that time. That's a big, big challenge. And if you don't, then you need to move your computing power somewhere, so that's also a challenge. And building a new data center, of course, is a costly affair, generally more costly than retrofitting, depending on the existing building. So there's a whole set of elements that go into that decision, and I would say roughly 70% of the existing data centers are in one way or another out of date. So a decision needs to be taken there. So there's a lot of work to be done by many companies to figure out what to do, retrofit or do a new building.
Okay, so I highlighted in my presentation, I think, some of the key competition really between some of the regions and locations, and if you look at locations in Sweden, Finland and Iceland that I've talked about. What does the panel think are going to be the key USPs will absolutely drive success for some of this flexible demand? Should we start with Sam?
Yeah, I think that, well, you said almost everything in your presentation, so I mean there's some key drivers as cost of power, because cloud platforms are using more power in smaller space. Connectivity is really important one, reliable infrastructure, manpower, logistics, which is good in Finland actually. It's easy to move stuff around. And also one thing mentioned before is the proximity to Russia, because it's a huge market, it's growing fast. We have the benefit of being just about 1,300 kilometers of joint border. And we have existing low latency, high diversity routes to Russia. And there are land cables, they're not sea cables, which is cheaper and more reliable. And privacy is one thing. Privacy is very strict here in Finland. We are not looking for net traffic. We are not tracking what you're doing. Not in this the most ones.
And John, what's your view given that you're based in Oslo?
Well, this afternoon when you go on the site visit, you'll see the main building, which I call the cathedral. We have a developed plan to create 10,000 metres of white space in that building. That is only suited for what Gabriel's referred to as one of the flexible wholesale users, and we're talking to 3 prospective users of that scale. I've got to reiterate my point. The big selling point for them coming in will be green, cheap power. That's what I'm looking for, but the site is fantastic. We will be installing air-to-air modules. We can do it progressively, and when you see the size of that building and inside, you'll appreciate the ease with which we can do that. We're very comfortable with the provision of power, albeit that we will have to put in backup power for us and the customers. The local resource and competency seems certainly a jolly good starting point and better than we've received elsewhere. But the key driver is that power issue.
Yeah. Well, yeah, a lot of good things have been said about the site, and I think I won't repeat those. There's a couple of things I want to add. One is, well, if you look at Finland, it was already mentioned that it could be a hub between actually Western Europe and Russia, and Russia being one of the big countries, so that's a very significant hub. If you look at the 4 cities where you have most of the data center activity, as Gabriel explained, Amsterdam is one of those, and it's quite surprising because it's a small city. I happen to be from Amsterdam, so it's close to my heart. Yeah, but Amsterdam is also having a hub function between, let's say, England and continental Europe. So a hub function is a very important capability, and it can really lead to mention is I believe in food courts. You know what food courts are? It's something in the US where you have really a location where you have a lot of different restaurants. So apparently the restaurants actually are competing with one another. They also benefit from each other's presence. So having, let's say, a campus of many data centers is also like a food court. I believe in those, and I believe in those for data centers as well. Just one word of caution. We talk a lot about free air cooling and the conditions in Finland and the Nordics in general. That you can have free air cooling. I do see a tendency, a longer-term tendency, that the temperatures in data centers go up. ASHRAE has been established. The envelope has been established in 2009. And we're working to ASHRAE now, which is already a lot higher temperature than it was like 10 years ago. And if you look at the development of liquid cooling going to the processor, or even submerged servers, I'm not sure which of the two will actually develop, but temperatures in data centers go up, which means that in the end there will be more free air cooling also in slightly warmer climates. The capability of free air cooling may come up also in the slightly warmer climates. So I see a window of opportunity right now in the Nordics for free air cooling. It's closing at some point, or closing, it's not really closing, but there will be more competition coming out of other countries that has to be taken into account. So this opportunity needs to be taken.
I just want to add one thing. I also think it's important when you look at lots of the corporates, it's all those good things here, but there also needs to be the planning on how you do real disaster recovery, and that's not the brick wall between two halls in one building. That's at least 20 to 25 Ks. So you have to think of that when you want to attract corporates into those data centers.
And could I just endorse the point on the free air cooling? You're quite right. There are evolving technologies that I can get almost as good PUE as I can here in the desert. So you have got an advantage, but you won't have it forever, so grab it while it's there.
Yeah.
So moving back specifically to the USB point, Seppo, you've been operating in Finland for quite a while. What's your view in terms of that USB that's so important?
Someone else says,
For this question. Something else.
Okay, yes, that's
I think we've touched on the main USPs, which is temperature, connectivity, security, stability, political, and a government that is manifestly encouraging business.
Maybe one thing I can add for this is, of course, how the co-location provider or the data center provider is operating. What's the flexibility? What's the business model? And how they do the business? How the customer can trust them?
okay, brilliant. Well, I think in a minute we're going to take some questions. We're going to take your questions now, so I'm keen to get those questions. Anyone in the audience want to put a question to the panel?
So I'll move as fast as I can.
Question for the panel to come to cloud. Do you see a benefit or a trend in cloud moving to out-of-city locations and the advantages that some out-of-city locations have? By explaining the question.
Can I take a start on that one? I do see a lot of data centers were started in sort of the middle, or at least close to the center of cities. And the first efficiency discussions I saw coming up was because there was a limited power available in certain areas of the cities, and all of a sudden data centers became more efficient, not just because they were more sustainable. I mean, it looked nice and they looked more sustainable, but in actuality there was a limited amount of power to be divided, and then you better have it available for the IT infrastructure than for the cooling and actually the power losses that you have. And so that limited power availability is still an issue in the cities. And so that's one compelling reason to also move outside the cities. and actually move the data centers to where the power is and not the power to where the data center is. After all, optical fiber is cheaper than actually power connections and making more power available at the locations that data centers are built.
Yeah. So exactly on that right, that thing as well, because it was power and it was as well communication costs earlier on, and it's extremely important now, and that's coming up with the fiber, etc. That's why we see this here in Kajaani, because you need to have the network. It's going to be crucial for the future. We know the increased demands of gigabytes, zettabytes, whatever it's going to be transferred, and but that has dramatically changed over the last 10 years on the cost of that and the availability of it, and that's going to be crucial also. But that driving it makes it also possible to keep it in other locations that you first thought of.
Okay, we'll just go to John and then we'll take another question. So John, straight for you.
Well, you referred earlier on to certain customers being server huggers, and we're certainly familiar with that. And if it's a relatively small corporate outsourcing project of perhaps a couple of 100 meters, then our experience is that the customers do like to come and look at their kit. In our central Oslo facility, I was staggered a couple of years ago. I did a check on security and reception, and we were getting a footfall of about 1,000 people through that building every week. Most of them were wearing anoraks. Most of them were going to hug a server. It would be interesting to get some statistics from the likes of Google, the big flexible wholesale users that we've heard today. Is that the same experience? And I sense it's not. I think they're on to remote control. It's very much mission control from the West Coast to the USA, and it would be a different profile, but it would be an interesting statistic.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think there's absolute extremes. When you look traditionally at the corporates that I was talking about before, the investment banks, not only do they have this 40-kilometre radius around their primary data centre that is located, but even within that 40-kilometre radius, they're still very much focused on how do I get there, how quickly can I get my people to the site, which has actually driven that latency, driven demand. So,
I just could add one comment on that, because when one now looks at the larger corporations that are into the second or third round of outsourcing, they really don't care where it is, as long as they have an SLA working on the network, etc. In the beginning, and they were very much more keen on having it closer. And that's going to happen also into the mid-range. They don't going to server hug in 10 years. They don't going to think about it.
Let's move on to
They shouldn't care.
Okay, let's move on. We've got another question.
Yes, we were discussing the USB part of going to Finland, and I think one big point is the availability of power in huge amounts. Because this, for example, is a very restricting issue in London, the availability of power, and it's relatively cheap in London. You pay around £1 million to get 1 megawatt connectivity, then you pay the power bill after that, which is high as well. And here you more or less get the connectivity to power for free. And I also disagree with the cost of land and building, because we're talking about, if big investors come here, we're talking about data centers being at least 10,000 and multiples of that, square meters white space. First investments would be relatively high. The risk, because we bet a little bit on the future, would be relatively high. So if you don't have to make all these big investments, because the building is more or less there, and you can rent or buy as much as you need for now, and you have the expansion in the future, also with respect to the availability of power. This is the USP for Finland and places like Miami.
Okay, good point. I think, to be honest, we're going back to the key drivers though, and that's the point. What's actually driven that flexible demand? Would those companies, there's a penalty there, would you say that Google would not have gone somewhere different because the price of land was slightly more expensive? I think the answer is probably not. It was much more about the green power, the cost of power, and other things that we looked at.
But also the availability of power.
Yeah, absolutely right.
I think that's a point I would love to have made myself, but you beat me, and that is when you're looking at a comparative table of electricity pricing, it tends to have those components which in Finland we are quite aware of, which is based on Nord Pool, and how you build up that pricing. There always seems to be one missing column. What do you have to take out of your pocket on day one to make sure that you're connected. And we are very clear here that can be very significant. It can be very significant east of here also. So we're aware that that's one advantage, and I'm very grateful that you raised that. I'm not sure if it was a question, so that's my question. Any other questions?
Thank you. A lot's been mentioned about power, and Anna's talked about the price of power and how power is generated, whether it's through renewable generation or through more traditional generation. But one thing that has had little time on this panel is actually the total reduction in the amount of power that's used. I think cloud models, whether they're private or whether they're managed in an outsourced way, offer the ability to reduce power consumption enormously through consolidation, virtualization of both server and data centers. I wonder if anybody has more of an opinion on that.
Peter, you have to keep that one.
Let me just pause for a moment. Well, what I see is, let me just think. Well, why don't someone else go first?
I could talk from that perspective, because you're spot on in that sense. If you currently look at what is needed in power consumption from a number of servers that you could, in deploying new technologies with the same amount of data processing capacity that you have today, which might be utilized even through virtualization not more than 40%, right, through automation, and this could be done, and then you could call it cloud, but cloud is a broad word, but through fully automated infrastructure, you can drive it either as a private cloud, which we already discussed, that we're going to see some of the large financial institutions, large corporations, they want to have it like that, go to public cloud for some and mid-sized corporations, that you can drive up the capacity and usage of those servers that still needs the power, even if they use it 40% to 85%. And then you just can calculate how much you could save on that. And I think another aspect of it as well, which is more not from the data center build, but really from the total infrastructure cost, is that you really leverage the capex that you do. Because having a capex investment and you utilize it to 40%, you would never run a production line in a car factory with 40% utilization.
I think actually, it's very, very quickly, time's got better, so quick final remark.
Yeah, well, I got my thoughts together. Actually, the point I was going to make is, if you look at the power consumption, we tend to focus, at least in these kind of forums, on just the facility side, which is important. But it's still a bit of a tunnel vision. We've been talking the last 5 years about PUEs. And PUEs, again, is concentrated on the facility side. So we really have to look across IT infrastructure and facility infrastructure. So we really have to look at, and you mentioned it already, the number of cycles per watt in the end, the processor cycles that we talked about. I believe an important element in there, and it's the first step in the direction, is data center infrastructure management, DCIM. It can really look across the IT infrastructure and the facility infrastructure, and do actually generate, first of all measure, but in the end generate optimization across those two. We don't have proper metrics for that. I mean, it's quite complex to come up with proper metrics, but still I think that's the next evolutionary step that I think we will see in terms of power usage. Optimization across IT and facility infrastructure.
Okay, all right, well, I think it's time to wrap up. I just want to say thank you very much to the panel for some questions in the
Ladies and gentlemen, leadership panel, thank you. Okay, change to the programme. I am a driver and I need to drive you back in here at 10:20 if I could, which is 10 minutes earlier than in the programme. We have 30 minutes networking coffee. Thank you.